Good evening. My name is Anna Vallier. I'm Assistant Professor of Art History and Architectural Studies here at Connecticut College. I'm going to do a brief introduction to today's events, and then we'll just talk. Thank you very much for coming. So, what was urban renewal? At the end of the Second World War in 1945, nation's confidence and optimism was at an all-time high. Emerging victorious from the war, the economy given a tremendous boost by wartime mobilization, and with Europe in ruins, the United States was riding at the head of what Time magazine described as the American century. But American cities also faced many problems. Accelerating urbanization through the turn of the century brought tidal waves of rural migrants into urban centers, and by 1937, FDR's National Resources Planning Board had declared that America had finally become a nation of cities. But the cities were 19th century artifacts, labyrinthine, overcrowded, with aging infrastructure and transportation built for the age of railway travel. In 1940, the U.S. Census for the first time showed that the population of suburbs had exceeded that of urban centers. Just 3 years after America had officially become the nation of cities, people started fleeing the cities for the suburbs. With cars becoming more and more affordable, and after 1945, federal mortgage subsidies under the GI Bill, the white middle class was fleeing the city, and industry, retail, and businesses soon followed. Already struggling to modernize, urban centers found themselves being rapidly depleted of their tax base. New London was not immune from this set of processes. A thriving regional center and tourist destination in the 19th century, New London was starting to see young families head out for new homes in smaller nearby towns like Waterford. The city's narrow streets, mainly laid out in the 17th century to accommodate horse-drawn carriages, were now clogged with automobile traffic. Navigating its bustling downtown retail hub became a headache, with traffic jams and no parking. And the larger regional and national retailers threatened to depart for suburban malls. The construction of the Connecticut Turnpike and later I-95, which ran along the shore from the New York State line to Rhode Island, was then underway just south of Hodges Square, promised to not only accelerate the movement of residents and businesses out of the city. In 1949, Congress finally passed legislation in the works since the late 1930s to tackle the urban problems of the mid-century. Title I of the Housing Act of 1949 dedicated large outlays of funds for so-called urban redevelopment programs, which enabled cities to acquire and clear acres of so-called blighted, meaning underdeveloped, low-income, and poorly maintained land for new housing, retail, and other cultural and civic purposes. Urban redevelopment, which was after 1954, renamed urban renewal, and this term stuck, was meant to revitalize aging cities, update them for the age of the automobile, and reverse the incentives draining cities of people and businesses. By the time the program came to an end in the country as a whole, in 1974, the federal government had approved over $13 billion worth of grants to over 1,200 municipalities across the country. New London was quick to take advantage of the new federal largesse. In 1950, City Council had applied for advanced planning funds, and a year later, New London set up its first redevelopment commission, which was an association of city officials and private citizens. The city's plans were humble at first, focused on creating more parking downtown, but Washington would only sponsor bolder thinking. And a new redevelopment commission established in 1958 launched what former Day reporter and historian Gregory Stone, who is here tonight, but what he called, quote, a sweeping slum clearance program to make room in the cramped downtown for new buildings, wider streets, and off-street parking, end quote. An area along the city's decaying waterfront north of downtown south of the highway and east of Huntington Street, was identified for clearance. And a prominent planner with a vast international portfolio, French-born Yale professor Maurice Rodeval, was hired to plan it. A high-speed road, today Eugene O'Neill Drive, would replace ancient Main Street, linking downtown to the just completed turnpike in 1958. In place of decrepit 19th century wood frame structures, modern luxury, middle and lower income housing would be built on what was called the Winthrop Cove Renewal Project site, complete with a new shopping center, new industries and warehouses along State Pier. The city was quick to commence clearance, eventually demolishing around 690 homes and small businesses in this predominantly lower middle class and working class areas that were targeted. Urban renewal's record across the country was mixed at best. Clearing the land proved easier than rebuilding it. Renewal sites across the country stood vacant and desolate for a decade, on average, before they would eventually be rebuilt. Some of the plans did not materialize at all, and others were curtailed due to mounting local resistance. But in the meanwhile, the lives of hundreds of thousands of families were disrupted. Renewal projects across the U.S. collectively displaced, at minimum, 1/3 families, and disproportionately targeted minority and lower class neighborhoods. Though displaced residents were meant to receive some combination of compensation, relocation assistance, or placement in public housing, these federally guaranteed measures were often too meager, did not materialize at all. This was true for New London as well. The Winthrop Cove plan displaced long-settled Polish-American and Italian-American communities already disrupted by highway and bridge construction. It took many years and was never quite realized as planned. The city followed it up into the mid-1970s with several new redevelopment projects for downtown and Shaw's Cove. By the time the so-called urban renewal era ended in New London, it had dramatically transformed the face of the city, much as it had throughout the country. So for this academic year, myself and a group of students and staff at Connecticut College have been working in a research project focused on tracing this history and its effects in New London in the broader context of the United States. So we are going to be building by early summer a website which will include the recollections of many former residents, some of whom are here tonight, and I hope to hear from them as well. But this is our very first public event, and for this event we have gathered here a group of planners and historians of planning to talk about, well, what was urban renewal and how does its legacy continue to resonate, not just in New London, but in the country as a whole. So I wanted to quickly introduce the discussants, and then we will have a conversation. Elizabeth Cohen is a scholar of American history. She is the Howard Mumford Jones Professor of American Studies and a Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of History at Harvard. From 2011 to 2018, she was the Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Her most recent book, called Saving America's Cities, Epilogue and the Struggle to Renew Urban America in the Suburban Age, is a fascinating, really fascinating reevaluation of the career of one of the most prominent, sort of forgotten planners of the urban renewal era, who was responsible for many redevelopment projects in New Haven, Boston, and New York City. It was published, it's hot off the presses, published this October with Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. The book is already widely acclaimed, with reviews published in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Boston Globe, The New Yorker, and many other venues. And it is available for purchase just outside. So I encourage you to do so if you're interested. Professor Cohen's previous books include Making a New Deal, Industrial Workers in Chicago, 1919 to 1939, winner of the Bancroft Prize and a finalist for the Pulitzer, and A Consumer's Republic, The Politics of Mass Consumption in Post-War America. Philip Michalowski is a professional planner and a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. He started his career in New London in 1969 as a planning consultant with James Purcell and Associates, who were working on a revised master plan for the city and a renewal plan for downtown. So just at the tail end of the events that I was just describing earlier, the Winthrop Cove Renewal Plan. In 1971, he became City Development Administrator for the City of New London, a position he kept for the next 8 years until 1979. He went on to a 50-year career in planning, working with federal, state, regional, and municipal authorities, neighborhood organizations, community associations, nonprofit organizations, private development and financing sectors in Connecticut and the Northeast. He was a principal planner with Malone and McBrew, and a partner in Harold, McLowski and Associates. He is recently retired and lives in New London. James Butler is also a member of the AICP, American Institute of Certified Planners. Since 1998, he is the Executive Director of the Southeastern Connecticut Council of Governments, the regional planning authority in Southeastern Connecticut. He has served as Interim Executive Director of the Southeastern Connecticut Enterprise Region, the region's economic development organization, and the Chairman of the Connecticut Association of Councils of Governments. In his 44 years of planning experience, he was also Director of Planning for the towns of Groton and East Lyme, and a Senior Planner for the Southeastern Connecticut Regional Planning Agency. In his free time, he pursued his passion for cross-country running by serving as Cahn's men's cross-country team coach for the past 30 years until retirement in 2017. So, welcome our speakers. Thank you very much for joining us today. Looking forward to this conversation. So my first question for you is simply, could you tell us what the urban renewal era means to you, and how did you come to think of it so in the course of your own careers?
Well, at the time that I got into the field, I wasn't thinking of the overall context of urban renewal and what it meant, but I think where we stand today, we need to think about the larger context that urban renewal played in what was shaping urban America at that period of time. You've had the urban areas of America, including right here in Connecticut. And remember, we're in the Northeast. The oldest cities in the country are here. They tend to be smaller communities, scattered throughout the state. Connecticut today still has the largest city is about 160,000. Bridgeport. It's the largest. It never evolved into the larger cities, the Bostons, cities of 500,000 to 1 million, which are a different animal. So there's the flight, the big program at the time that really set the framework for federal government funds in the United States was really the Interstate Highway Program. That was the big kahuna, if you would, at the time in terms of both dollars expended and impact on the landscape. In retrospect, the Interstate Highway Program and Coast Guard expansion, those two acquired more property and probably with a heavier hand than urban renewal, although I've read for 50 years how terrible urban renewal was. Many people have told me that directly. But the program was in its construct was probably too simplistic. It was looking at the physical features of a community. And it was looking at it from the lens of traditional kind of public projects. Government's there to put out the fires, public safety, build some roads, provide infrastructure. That was kind of the agreed upon role of government. And now you're having a direct intervention in the physical fabric of a community with the Renewal program, focusing just on the physical. That's as was said, fixing the infrastructure and providing sites, and putting on those sites what a community would like to see happen, without really any serious discussion with the private sector, who was going to provide the financing and do the construction. It was, when you think about it, it was kind of naive, because a major partner in the process was missing from the equation. The Renewal program was quite formalistic in its feds. You got 3 manuals provided how you conduct an urban renewal program. It was laid out, if you want to participate, this is what the community had to do. There wasn't much opportunity for being creative, moving off the path. The feds at that time had relatively a large staff. They reached out and created a bureaucracy that watched local communities pretty carefully. I think there was some distrust about the local communities having the wherewithal intellectually to run these programs. That was certainly sensed by someone who was working at the local level. So you're starting down a path where the ability to achieve the goals of the plans are limited. On the other side of the equation, they did something that hadn't been done before, and that was the requirement that local communities create a planning infrastructure. Up to that point, didn't exist. You did have, going back to the 1920s with kind of the advent of zoning. Remember, it was open season up to that point from the founding of the country. Now, you look at that in the context of a New London. New London was around 100 years before there was the United States of America. So, it had gone. The first urban renewal director was Benedict Arnold. He burned the place to the ground. In 1776, you're starting, or 75, you're starting all over again. So there had been a cycle already has occurred. The structure of the city program, as I said, was formalistic, highly regulated, and so you had to follow those requirements in order to go forward. Every community, and I learned this more after I left the city and became a private consultant working throughout the Northeast. It almost as if there was a stamp in each town, if you want to call it mistakes, or at least a lack of achieving goals you see in urban community after urban community throughout certainly the Northeast and probably throughout the country. The program ultimately, the inability to produce the desired result morphed a whole bunch of changes, which I'm sure we're gonna get to talk to how it was moderated. And I think one other point the program required a pretty large sweep. I think communities probably would have preferred smaller projects, but what the Winthrop project was, what, 140 acres in a dense community like New London. That's a big bite. Now the focus is on maybe a block, a half a block, repurposing buildings, more appreciation for the built environment. This city has so much history. You trip over it every day. You don't. The appreciation of what is here is not even today. My local citizens here, there's some who are passionate, but the majority do not really appreciate what's here. And at this time, there was like no appreciation for the built environment. The program in London and elsewhere still was a product of a lot of public discussion and ultimately referendums, certainly city council votes, appropriation of funds. Small percentage of money went to the projects in terms of their context between state and local. It was, if there was a 2 or 3% city dollar cash contribution, that was a lot, and the smarter cities used a provision within the urban renewal program that allowed you credit for other investments, like building a school. Schools in London were over 100 years old. They're better at the time. But if they built a school that was in the district that would serve ultimately the build out of a redevelopment area, they could use that money. So it's like $2, for one. So New London did quite a bit of that, trying to maximize its dollars. So all of that is the smorgasbord of kind of the error, and we can get into more detail. So I don't know if that helped or is that confusion.
I'm not quite as old as Phil.
Thanks, Jim.
I'm getting there. But certainly urban renewal in New London helped shape my own planning career, both from a personal sense and from a professional sense. Personally, my dad worked for the New London Redevelopment Agency during urban renewal's heyday here in New London, and went on to work for the Model Cities program, which we'll probably talk about during the course of this discussion. I'd like to just say hello to Mrs. Driscoll, because her husband, C. Francis Driscoll, was my dad's boss at the New London Redevelopment Agency and went on to become the greatest city manager this city has ever seen. And in some ways, was a hero of mine as I grew up professionally, because I wanted to conduct myself like Mr. Driscoll did in public. My mom also happened to be a one-term city councilor in the early 1970s, again during a time when urban renewal was happening. The Winthrop project had already started and probably was completed, but I believe the Shaw's Cove urban renewal project was probably underway at that time. So I knew that my parents were public servants and they were trying to improve our life here in the city. And that's what interested me in becoming a city planner or a regional planner. Professionally, it's influenced my career in that, and I think Mr. Michalowski alluded to this, these federal programs resulted in municipalities recognizing they needed to have a planning function in City Hall. They needed to have professionals that were trained by professors of urban planning who would teach us, I guess, to teach us how to avoid some of the mistakes of the urban renewal era. Phil mentioned that urban renewal primarily dealt with the physical or built environment. It cleared blighted housing. It relocated highways along with the Federal Highway Act. And it provided monies for infrastructure, extension of utilities, etc. What it didn't recognize, or recognize well enough, that there's a human component to renewing municipalities. And there were, as Anna said, there were so many hundreds of folks displaced in the city of New London. They had no voice in that displacement. Unfortunately, we lived it again, somewhat, during the Kilo case back in the 80s, I believe. So that's what the urban renewal era signifies to me. I didn't work really during that era. It certainly influenced the work I do today, the work I've done throughout my career. But I think both panelists on either side of me have a lot more experience and a lot more knowledge about it. So the ball is in your court.
Okay. Well, thank you, Anna, for including me, and all of you for coming. I do not know a lot about New London, but I have spent the last 14 years researching and writing about urban renewal more broadly. So I guess I'm here for the larger context. My book, Saving America's Cities, which Anna mentioned, is an effort to kind of shed some new light on what happened to cities in the second half of the 20th century. I came at it with a feeling that historians had focused on the shift to suburbanization and all the changes that brought in residence and retail, in work, with an implication that cities were suffering as a result, but very little investigation of what actually happened to cities and what the pressure of suburbanization, which was on a massive scale nationally, really meant for cities. And a lot of attention went to the ways in which the federal government had supported that suburban move with mortgage programs and the Highway Act. And all of the other ways that we incentivized, certainly white middle-class people, to be able to move to suburbs. And very little attention to what the federal government had done with cities. So that was where my entry point, and I decided to build the book around the career of a man named Ed Logue, who had worked from the early 1950s, where he started off in New Haven. During the 1960s, he moved to Boston. In the 1970s, late 60s, and into the mid-1970s, he headed a very powerful statewide urban renewal agency called the Urban Development Corporation, brought to New York State by Nelson Rockefeller. And then his last big job was in the South Bronx in the late 1970s to the mid-1980s, and he continued to work in the field until he died in 2000. So I wasn't so much trying to explain Ed Logue as use Ed Logue as a way to really get a handle on these changes. And some of the points that I try to make in the book that I think will come out in our discussion here are to try to get us to sort of step back a little bit from some of the oversimplification that I think has characterized urban renewal. First of all, we tend to dismiss it with one brushstroke as one disaster without really looking at the ways in which it actually changed from the 1950s to the 1960s and into the 1970s. These people were not dummies. They learned from mistakes. They made changes, and really taking that approach and understanding the way in which it evolved over time, I think, is very important. I also discovered that there were some progressive goals that may not have often been achieved or may have been misguided in certain ways, but some of the goals of people like Logue were actually quite admirable. They sought mixed income communities. They really were trying to figure out how to take on this kind of isolation across social class and race. Certainly Logue did. They weren't operating, as historians have suggested, according to the dictates of business. In many cases, in a New Haven or a Boston, business elites weren't the least bit interested in urban renewal, nor really in the city itself. They were moving to the suburbs with the people. So getting those business interests to reinvest in the city was part of the challenge. There were some things they sought that we have still failed to achieve today, like figuring out how to get metropolitan areas to work on urban problems together rather than to isolate into local authority. And that still is very much challenging in this country. People are very attached to their local communities, so that the problems of low-income urban residents are rarely shared in the metropolitan area. The solutions are rarely shared. And so there are a number of issues like this. Architecture was really, architects were really encouraged to think in a creative way about housing. Didn't always turn out as well as the developers hoped it might, but there was a kind of excitement about social housing in this country that we haven't seen since. Planning professions developed in the ways that was already mentioned. So I would, I guess, ask as we go into this discussion that we open our eyes a little bit and be a bit more flexible and not just dismissive without really considering both sides of the equation and the achievements as well as the failures.
Thank you. So Phil, you had mentioned that because of the mushrooming, fairly complex bureaucracy that the Urban Renewal Program had instituted in Washington, that many of the projects in cities were applied as though with a stamp. So there were broad similarities across the board, which is fascinating for a historian to look at. But I'm curious if you think, and this is a question for everyone, that there was something particular about the way that urban renewal process was applied on the East Coast, in the Northeast, in New London particularly.
Well, the program rules were the same for the entire United States, so I don't think there was a particular regional stamp per se. There may have been, in the architecture and how a community considered getting involved in the first place, and the debates that took place. Ultimately resulted in a political decision. We're going to go forward. We're going to try and use this vehicle. I mean, every municipality, I'm sure in the United States, doesn't feel that they have sufficient tax base to address their issues. That probably was the case. I mean, if you look at New London's history. This is kind of a tangent, but. New London started its existence as a settlement, ranging from somewhere in Rhode Island all the way through the to Old Saybrook down to Colchester. Okay, and every time the rural community farmers would collect and say, "Gee, we would want certain services," the town fathers would say, "Chop off a piece of this and become your own town. It's your problem. We don't want to." And in hindsight, those collective decisions over a couple of hundred years were really devastating because it whittled this community down to 6 square miles, which is probably never will be able to generate the kinds of revenue that can address the needs. We're constantly saying city spends too much money. It doesn't spend enough to be able to provide the quality of life that should be here. As a larger area, New England in particular, when we talk about regional differences, the rest of the country operates in much larger geographic areas. You could take, there are counties in the rest of the country that are large as the entire state of Connecticut. In Connecticut's 169 cities and towns, and within towns there are jurisdictions, sub-jurisdictions that people will take to the barricades if you talk about removing those powers. Broughton's representative here, former town manager is smiling because he's had to deal with those kinds of situations. So you have that kind of situation. So the desire to be able to get a significant amount of money, I think Winthrop, I think, was a grant of around $30 million at that time. So that was huge. There was no way that a city could raise that kind, even if it wanted to bond. Probably didn't have the asset base to even bond that much money to take on a significant infrastructure project. So trying to reach out to get those dollars was very alluring. I think the requirements, certainly for planning, at that time also you didn't have, most towns didn't have housing codes. So you had no basis. So you had to put in place the basic building codes, which were relatively simplistic. You had to have a housing code, a plumbing code, an electric code. So that was a mandate to even get into the program, and then to do a general plan. All of that was a requirement. So and those have stuck. There's almost certainly on the East Coast, there's almost all communities have a professional planner if they're of any size whatsoever, and the focus is on trying to manage folks rubbing up against each other and keeping peace in your community. That's really what zoning, the tool of zoning, is in place to try and enforce. The other elements that it generated were, I think it took a long time, but it did evolve in a greater appreciation for the built environment of the community. Certainly New London evolved over those times. A lot of stories in the day about this building being torn down that had historic merit. You can go back and look at that. And there was concern, and most of the citizens didn't really care. But gradually there was a community consensus that we're losing things of value, that that urban context, that built environment should remain and be reconfigured, repurposed, and provide some continuity in the in the environment of a community. New things can be placed and moved. So that is, I think, a product. Certainly, New London is much more interested in its physical fabric at this point than it was in the past. From purely a financial perspective, one thing, New London was very aggressive in going after these federal dollars, and as the grant transitioned to the block grant program, the fact that New London on a per capita basis did very well, and Ed Loeb was the high priest really almost throughout America in terms of his ability to really bring to New Haven significant dollars to undertake the program. New London was right, as far as Connecticut, New London was right behind New Haven in terms of per capita grant. At one point, the city was within the top 10 in the country on a per capita basis in terms of receipt. That resulted, when block grant came, to a guarantee of like $6.5 million guaranteed for a 5-year period as a transition. that doesn't, $6 million doesn't sound like much in today's world where we're talking throwing trillions around. But at that time, that was significant. General fund was about 12 million, and it was discretionary. Not like the general fund budget where every penny is really spoken for before the budget is even worked on. So that was a very important product of the block grant, of the renewal era, if you would. So, Jimmy?
I knew when I saw the order, I was in trouble following Phil Michalowski. And I certainly, that was emphasized when Phil sat down and I opened up my briefcase and I took out a bunch of plans that we have in our library at the Council of Governments. And I said, I brought some old documents, and Phil leaned over and said, I wrote them all. But I want to emphasize something that Phil said at the beginning of his response to this question, and that is New London unique, or was its urban renewal experience unique? And I think the one thing he said that the plans point out, and anybody who lives in New London for any period of time quickly comes to realize, is our 6 square miles are somewhat confining. We probably were, if not the smallest, one of the top 10 smallest of those 1,258 American cities participating in the federal urban renewal program.
Only Derby.
Was smaller?
Derby, Connecticut,
Okay.
which is like 3 square miles.
Why don't you just answer for me, because you wrote this document. I'm going to quote from. But what this document says, and this is the city's master plan program from 1971, Phil? You should remember. 1967. It says, with only 279 acres, or 8% of the city's total land area vacant and usable, mostly in the outlying areas, the city is, for all practical purposes, totally developed. Therefore, for New London to utilize its inherent regional advantage and potential, developable land must be made available. It goes on to say, with only an insignificant amount of vacant land remaining, New London's future physical development, economic conditions, and population growth will be determined by its ability to clear existing deteriorating areas and create developable land for new construction. Every municipality had that issue to a certain extent. That's why they got involved in this program. I think the allure of the federal dollars was key. New London, with the exception of, I guess, the whaling era, has never been the most affluent municipality in southeastern Connecticut. When the federal government comes calling and offers basically free studies, to the best of my knowledge, these were funded by the federal programs that
Yes.
Anna referenced in her opening remarks. And then if you did the studies and conformed to the formula, you would qualify for millions of dollars to ostensibly improve your city. I want to talk a little later when we get on about what else I think was unique in New London. And that's, again, the people that were administering the program, the people that were making the decisions, who, after, my living through it as a youngster and being related to some of the participants and knowing people like Phil Michalowski and Frank Driscoll, I think we had some very, very qualified folks running our program. It could have, although some folks have considered a disaster, and I'm so happy to hear you say there is another side of that story. I think New London's program was probably as good as could be found in the country, and I'll make that argument later.
Okay, so I think Phil's right that there were these national guidelines so that to some extent the program looked the same all over wherever cities got this funding, but I think there were some unique characteristics of New England cities like New Haven and New London and Boston, really. They were old manufacturing cities. So the base, the economic base that they had depended on for centuries was disappearing. And their economic problems really began much earlier than the post-World War II period. In many of these cities, they were in trouble by the turn of the 20th century, and they were kind of limping along. World War I and then World War II gave them little boosts. but they really had a problem with how they were going to employ people and have, an economic base to the city. And they then, because they were old cities in terms of their infrastructure and their built environment, they faced problems that were kind of typical of these cities, such as cities that were laid out in a pre-car era with narrow streets. Many of them had trolley systems that were being dismantled. And the car, as we've mentioned earlier, was coming in, and they had very little provision for parking. There were one of the important ways that these cities had coped with the decline of manufacturing was to become a retail center for their regions. And the local department stores were often really important for bringing people. I have a quote in the book from an executive at Maley's department store in New Haven who says, I remember when the buses brought people downtown to New Haven to do all their shopping. And those days were disappearing, and they were disappearing not only because of the difficulties of parking, but as suburbanization was growing, the shopping centers were burgeoning in the beginning of the 1950s, expanding in the 1960s, and even people who lived in the city were ending up going to the suburban shopping centers because it was easier to park. Parking was free. The new stores were going there. And even when a city like New Haven worked very hard to get a new department store, feeling as it had been losing them, and did in fact recruit Macy's, Macy's made it clear that, first of all, there were certain stipulations. There had to be parking that you could access from the highway. And they also said, as long as this is working for us, we'll stay. But as soon as it's not, we're out of here. And that was true in many of these cities. Then you add to that the problem that you mentioned, Phil, with the National Highway Act, that many of these cities were actually being cut off by those highways. So New Haven built the connector from I-95 to downtown New Haven to try to get people to still come downtown to shop. There also were local institutions like local newspapers. And when I asked Anna for some information about New London's urban renewal, she sent me the wonderful chapters from Gregory Stone's The Day paper about the newspaper and its involvement in urban renewal. And that was very much the case. I write about the Boston Globe and its deep investment in urban renewal in Boston, because newspapers depended on advertising for their revenue. And they also were facing this challenge of should they become metropolitan newspapers and be available to people as they moved out. Other institutions like the Catholic Church in Boston became also very invested in the city because the church owned so much property and real estate in the city of Boston, churches and hospitals and schools, and that may have very well been the case here as well. So one of the main points I really want to convey is that it's easy for us to be dismissive, but look at all of those problems that I just listed, and put yourself back in the mindset and the problem-solving mode of people at the time. And what were their options? Their options were very limited. And so, it's easy for us to say, well, they never should have torn things down. And I would just close by saying that some of the interesting developments that came out of this sort of overly aggressive activity, if you will, are really quite positive things. For example, communities, and this was kind of referred to, did sort of learn to negotiate and to speak out and not to be trampled. And so there really was the rise during the 1960s of a kind of community pushback and then a community engagement ultimately in the planning process in many cities. And I would also add and reinforce the point that I think you made, Jim, that historic preservation was really discovered in many ways in the process of urban renewal. We might not have come to appreciate certainly Victorian buildings at the beginning of this process were not considered to be architecturally significant. But over time, there got to be an appreciation of that urban fabric that might not otherwise have happened.
Can I just jump in a little bit? I think what happened to retail, I think is important. because New London was so laser focused. We have to have a department store. The city fathers were almost obsessed with it. You'll see, we spent years trying, really tilting it with windmills. The city never really had a chance. They had the site, they had money for parking garages, and Chase Malley's was going to be one of the prizes. G. Fox, I mean, around step back a few years before that plan, the Winthrop plan was amended to include downtown. You had Montgomery Wards out of downtown, right across from City Hall. You had a Grants, you had a Woolworths, you had a Kresge's, and these were all. They were all downtown, and they make the corporate decision. Those were our, as close as we got to a national kind of change. They made the corporate decision. We're out of here. We're following the suburban movement. We're going to the next interchange. And so they kind of disappeared early in the process, and the city tried to, okay, how can we repurpose? So, and some of the buildings were really, particularly Montgomery Wards, I still think about that. That was a gorgeous building, and it was perfect with big floor plates, and it could have been reused in so many ways. And I guess the time SNET tore it down and did that little one-story.
Could I just add something here about the retail side? I think one of the tragic sides to this is that many of these downtowns, in addition to having the department stores you mentioned, had a lot of family-run businesses, yes. Independent. All those employees were family members, and they, were viewed by many of the urban redevelopers as sort of not the future. That they needed to get, understandably, because those big stores seemed to be where people wanted, and they were popping up in all these shopping centers, and so they sacrificed in many places the small family businesses, which couldn't compete. They couldn't be open 7 days a week. They couldn't be open evenings. And so in many cases, they never when there was clearance, and they were going to supposedly, in a place like New Haven, they were going to come back downtown in Chapel Square Mall. Many of them never could. Right. They couldn't survive that dislocation, and they also just couldn't compete. So in the end, when then Malley's and Macy's and whatever you got gets up and goes, sadly, they would have been better off sticking with those small family businesses, because they actually did have a future that wasn't recognized at the time.
For the students here, I'd just like to note, when I was growing up, downtown New London had 3 movie theaters, I believe, several family-owned jewelry stores. We had the best women's store or stores in the region. We had several high-class men's clothing stores. There was a place you would go if you were a Boy Scout to buy your Boy Scout uniform and your equipment. And I'll never forget, growing up as a young child, some of my siblings, not my children, my siblings' fondest memories were when Mom said, all right, school's going to start in a couple weeks. We're going to get to the Capitol or to the Guard. We're going to watch a movie, and then we're going to, and Mr. Griner remembers the name of the store, I can't remember. We'd go buy shoes, and when you bought shoes, new shoes for school, you were given a pencil box that you could use at school. Downtown was thriving. It was bustling. This is in the late 50s, early 60s.
Right.
But as Elizabeth said, they followed the big stores out to the suburban malls.
Right. And the important part was that these were really independent merchants. And that's the difference, and now communities fight to try and... Independent merchants couldn't exist at that time because you had a national movement taking place in retail. It has to be bigger, ultimately ending up with the big box. We're going to sell it cheaper. I remember merchants downtown telling me, I can't buy the merchandise for what those guys out at the mall are selling it for. How am I going to be a viable business? You had also these businesses, the family businesses, sometimes were second generation. They had been around, and they're 60, 70 years old. They folks are getting tired. It's time, and they can't sell the business because, again, you can't get the product. And so the personality, all of the good things that come from the smaller scale of retailing are kind of lost to price competition. We want it cheap. That was a collective decision, across the country, and we lost so much of that. New London is trying to convince people to locate here. They wanted to reuse the building fabric too, and there's another nuance in the retailing sector. The stores in New London were relatively narrow and very deep. The retail world said the best configuration is not so deep and very wide. So you couldn't even produce the building shape that the retailers wanted. So you have all these layers of issues that the community is trying to fight with their for sale sign, and we want a store here. That was that really was tilting at windmills.
Of course, today with retail moving online, it's not such a big issue.
Well, except that I would say that what we're going through today is actually pretty parallel to a similar kind of revolution. And another irony is that, I don't know about around in Connecticut, but in Boston, the message has been so well taken that now we should have mixed use in all structures. So condos and apartments should all have retail on the ground floor, offices and residences should be mixed. The mistake of the urban renewal era being the separation of functions. So every project that goes up in Boston now is going to have retail on the first floor. One wonders what retail? Because in fact, they're expensive, and so there'll be chains if they're anything. But we're living through, I think, a similar kind of change today. So for the young people, it's equivalent.
Mm-hmm.
And this sort of leads to the next question I was going to next and last before I open it up to the audience. So some of the problems that you've outlined are still with us today. Some of them were even arguably products of the urban renewal era. Certainly the disinvestment in public transportation in favor of the automobile is very much something that cities are struggling with today. I would add to the list of problems the lack of affordable housing, although this was an issue that urban renewal was very much trying to address and was not able to do so effectively. So what are some of the issues, of the problems that cities are facing today, do you think? And which of these were similar to what the urban renewal planners were confronted with? Which are different? Which are products of urban renewal?
Could I start? Sure. Last year, the Council of Governments, at the request of current Mayor Michael Passero, chose to study the impact that the tax-exempt status of nonprofit agencies have on an urban center like New London. And we didn't just look at New London, we looked at, I think, 4 or 5 communities in southeastern Connecticut. And I would suggest that in New London particularly, this is somewhat of an unintended consequence of urban renewal. As stores and other successful businesses fled the cities, more and more folks came to the cities to seek inexpensive housing because they might not have had anywhere else they could afford to live. They required human services. They required social services. And so many of those state agencies and nonprofit have moved to urban centers like New London. And that's had a terrible impact, a very significant impact on the erosion of the tax base, the grand list. I'm not suggesting, and nor did our study or did the mayor ask us to suggest, that these nonprofits that provide services, much needed services to those that need them the most, he did not request, nor did we study or suggest that they be taxed. But we did look at other ways that we could potentially help cities like New London, make up for this tax loss. And if you think about it, the more a city like New London loses taxable businesses and properties, and they're replaced by non-taxable entities, the situation just snowballs and gets worse. New London becomes more poor, and there are fewer people, fewer taxable property owners that are bearing the burden of paying for the cost of city services. And those city services become more burdened, and we need to hire more police. We need to hire more fire people, firefighters. Thank you. Because there's a lot of people in New London that need this type of service now. So I would suggest that's an unintended consequence of urban renewal. As more disadvantaged people moved to the city, they required more services. The services came here to provide them meals, to provide them counseling, to provide them whatever service they needed. But it's the city's remaining taxpayers, and mostly, primarily residential now, that are paying for that.
Well, urban renewal also put a big premium on civic and cultural institutions. There was a shortage of in cities at the time. So nonprofits are among those.
Yes.
Can I ask Jim, though, how effective the pilot that Connecticut finally did get or enact? I thank you for what you said, not terribly effective.
It's never been fully funded by the state.
Not even close.
Not even close, and it's pretty much nil right now. So, as I recall, over 50% of New London, remember only 6.1 square miles, over 50% of the land area of New London does not pay property tax. In addition to the human service agencies, we're very fortunate to have three very fine three very fine higher education institutions: Connecticut College, Mitchell College, and the United States Coast Guard Academy. We also have many state agencies, and New London was the county seat way back when, so at one time people came to New London to worship. We have more churches and synagogues than any municipality in southeastern Connecticut. They, of course, don't pay taxes. And it's just a fact. It's happened that way. So,
yeah. That goes back to the issue of a viable boundary area for a municipality to be able to sustain itself. Clearly, New London has historically been the regional center and provided this large range of services and institutions and entertainment and stuff, which is a function of a real city. But what has been detached from it is the ability to support it. The notion, I can remember going to Hartford with City Manager Driscoll. We had a number of bills filed with the legislature for consideration of what we privately called reparations payments. Our surrounding neighbors were benefiting from the city performing this function, taking the poor, taking those that had some problems or illnesses or what have you, coming to the city and then not participating in the cost of that. At this point, the legislature, way back in the 70s, had the power structure moved from kind of the urban dominance in the legislature to suburban, and every year that would get kind of, thank you very much, get laughed out of and dies in committee, and over and go. And the urban areas still try various tax sharing initiatives over the years, and none of them have received any serious consideration at all. And I think that's a real problem. If some of that got solved, the city could do a much better job throughout, from the physical side to the social side that it supports, and would remove the kind of the disproportionate burden that's placed upon local residents.
Well, we've touched on a lot of things. I guess I would say that we're living in a nation today where I think there's tremendous inequity between cities. We have the cities that are prospering, New York, Washington, San Francisco, Los Angeles, maybe Atlanta, and then you've got the Baltimores and the Bridgeports and the Clevelands and so we have this a nation of real difference in how cities are doing, but I think the great problem is that even in the cities that are doing well, there still are many of the same problems that these urban renewers were trying to deal with in the 1950s. The issues of affordable housing are tremendous, whether a city is actually rich or poor today. If you're a fire economy, of finance, insurance, real estate, tech, you're doing well, but other people who are there living in those cities to service the people who are now living downtown and not fleeing to the suburbs are in many ways struggling with schools that often aren't adequate in unaffordable housing and so forth. Urban infrastructure, even in a prosperous city like Boston, where I live, is in terrible shape because we haven't invested in it. So we have an MBTA that's barely limping along because we have not been investing in the public goods. And, we've not been, cities can't do that, as we've said, on their own. It really, I think, takes federal dollars, and we have not been willing to make that happen as a society. I don't think we've succeeded very well creating mixed income communities. There are many measures now of greater inequality by class and race in the United States than even back to this period of the 1950s. And this issue, I'll just close on the issue of that you both touched on, of this, our difficulty operating beyond the locality, the unwillingness to have metropolitan problem solving, regional planning, leaving, then creating a world of the haves and the have-nots, because where you live, that address, that community, that tax base determines the quality of your services, of your schools, of your transportation, of so many things. And so our, unwillingness, our dependence on that locality and and local property taxes for revenue, Connecticut being, out there with New Jersey, I think, as probably the most property tax dependent state, leads to these kind of problems. And I think my own view is until we take on the big scale of them, we will just continue to struggle with many of these problems.
Well, I'd like to open up to our audience, because I'm sure that people have a lot of questions.
So this is mostly Ms. Cohn, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how the notion of can't trust the private sector to protect the public interest shaped the way that urban renewal and planning in general happened during the Logue period and also during the renewal period in New London, because it seems like this really complicated contradiction.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, because, we've always had public-private partnerships. I mean, that nothing happens just by government in the United States all the way back. It's always been a combination of public-private. I think what changes over time is who's in the driver's seat. And one of the things that I do value in the urban renewal period is the willingness of the federal government to play some role in urban redevelopment, even if some of the things that happened were misguided in the ways that we've talked about. Today, I see many cities struggling to try to figure out how to solve these serious problems that we've talked about by basically having to squeeze resources out of the private sector. So having inclusionary zoning, if you want your market priced housing in downtown Boston, you need to build In Boston now, it's 13% of your units have to be affordable, or you pay into a fund that housing will more likely get built in what is already a low-income neighborhood. Trying to attract an Amazon or a GE, which we stole from you in Connecticut, and then they left Boston as well after kind of going broke. So that, there's, I think the balance today is problematic, because I think a lot of the choices, there's an area of Boston called the Boston Seaport area, which is, I think, just a quintessential statement of what happens when there's no planning and it's just what the private sector wants to build that they think will bear some profit. And so it just is, one hotel and convention center and very expensive condo after another. It's a neighborhood, if you can call it that now, that has the largest percentage of upper class white population of anywhere in the city, because there just has been no attention to some of these other issues. So finding that balance, we're always going to have public and private doing this together, but I like to feel that if we can even understand what the public interest and the public good is, and that's a complicated proposition. We haven't even talked about NIMBYism and all the issues about whose voice is really speaking for the community. But to the extent that we can get at that, because we have a process where we try to bring as many people to the table as we can, then I'd like to think that that's dictating what's happening, not what what a corporation thinks will be the most profitable investment to make in a city.
So I too had written down this quote from Ed Loeb that you can't trust the private sector with the public interest. And I think, in a sense, this very conversation we're having is operating at the level of the private sector. And so I'm wondering if you believe that too much of the discourse and modern critique surrounding urban renewal exists in a sort of elitist echo chamber, and whether the manner of conversation with which we discuss urban renewal needs to further cross socioeconomic boundaries to avoid perpetuating the very problems that we study and critique.
Maybe you
that
people
will
should.
require an academic.
I would be interested to hear your practitioners working in this field, how you experience the public-private balancing act that is really at the core of all these issues. I think is it's about dollars and who's really determining how they're going to be spent and what we're going to do with them.
I mentioned model cities in my response to the first question. And if I understand model cities correctly, it was like urban renewal phase 2 or 3.
Wow.
And it too had its own form. It lasted 10 or 15 years, as I recall.
Not even that long. No.
But it did require public participation, citizen participation.
And so did renewal. I guess the question becomes, what's the appropriate extent of public participation? You did have a planning process where public was involved as these plans were getting evolved. So at that time there wasn't social media and all there. We were in a room like this. People would get together. Presentations, would be made. People would comment and the like. Was that enough? We then revert to the formalized process of the local governing body, who is, they're getting tapped on, particularly in a little town like New London. It's 6 square miles. The advantage is your elected representatives cannot hide from you, so citizens here tapping people on the shoulder. I know I was stopped in the grocery store 1,000 times about one issue or another. And so, a consensus gets developed and it gets formalized by a vote. There were, I'm not sure about Winthrop, but I know that the Shaw Cove project went through a referendum process. There was a debate in the town. The political parties took took positions, and the citizens came out and they said, yes or no, we're going to do this or we're not going to do it. So, I mean, isn't that the basis for our, participation? It comes to a point. There's some people unhappy with that, and others are saying that's what we should do. So, I think that's our system. When we got to model cities, we then started a much more fine-grained process around a series of issues around lack of jobs and no training, education, medical issues, substance abuse, lack of housing. And the community was engaged with a lot of outreach, particularly to the minority communities, where instead of the public coming to City Hall, at least the planning process and the elected officials and appointed officials that were involved would go into usually using schools, because that's the closest facility of any scale that would have. So there were hundreds and hundreds of meetings to discuss issues that resulted in specific plans, and much of it directed towards additional or revised social services, not necessarily the physical. The physical tended to be very fine-grained. We haven't had a sidewalk on my street that was walkable for 50 years. Fix it. Or, my park is terrible. We need some swings. We need a place for the kids to play. Let's adapt and put some playscapes in the school, because the school is functioning after school as a community collection point. So rather than kind of the big picture, you're the little picture of where people live. So I think that was a dramatic improvement, and people who kind of got involved, who were never involved in any kind of public discourse before. After 10, 15 years, some of them are elected on the city council. They got engaged and became a voice, and you've got certainly the minority community in this town involved through that process, even though it was shortly lived, and it changed the direction. Then you went into the community development block grant, where you got a set amount of money each year, and then the Citizens Advisory Committee helped recommend how it would be carved. All the organizations would present their projects to them, and they would have a voice on where the dollars would get allocated. And then, of course, the council would change it so what they thought.
I think that's a great description of what happened then. In today's age, though, there is a federal emphasis, federal requirement that we go beyond what we traditionally did in terms of reaching underrepresented populations, folks that don't come out, don't join committees, may not be a member of a political party. And there are requirements called Title VI in the Federal Highway Act, environmental justice programs, where we have to go out and we have to seek people out before we build a road through their neighborhood, and we have to discuss it with them. I'm sure it was happening back then. But I think what Urban Renewal did, it resulted in the federal government recognizing it needed to change the rules as to how cities and towns around the country were going to deal with their built environment, deal with their transportation infrastructure. And everybody has a voice now, if they want to have a voice.
So this was great to hear you talk about your own, what you observed and participated in, and it's actually a major part of what I write about, in that I chart a shift from in the 1950s, what I call pluralist democracy, which was, yes, there were mandates in that federal legislation that there be community input, but in a city like New Haven, where Logue was working in the 1950s, their assumption was that a public official like Logue and those he worked with actually were representing the public good. They were and that they would consult with representatives of established interest groups. And so they created this community-wide organization that had representatives from every group, like the PTA and the business community and the Red Cross and the NAACP. But the people would speak for these very established interest groups. And it wasn't that one of the points I really make is that they weren't being intentionally undemocratic in that not opening that up more broadly. They actually felt that they were being democratic. But coming out of World War II, they were very afraid of what they had seen happen in Europe and what the mob and what democracy could be like if it kind of was not controlled. And so there was this sense that we have a consultative process of these established interest groups. By the 1960s, the world changes totally. And that I call a participatory democracy. And it comes, I don't think so much from the top down. I think the feds and people like Logue would have been perfectly happy to continue to make decisions for communities, feeling that they were doing it with the community's interests at heart. It really came from people pushing back and saying, wait a minute, you're not consulting with the people who are being affected by these programs. And it was particularly in New Haven, in a city like New Haven, it was the African American community that really said, wait a minute, we're being pushed, even though the established NAACP and CORE and many of those people really thought urban renewal would help their people because it would open up parts of the city for housing that had been closed off through a kind of segregated housing market, real estate market. That wasn't what was happening. And so kind of grassroots people started to push back and say, wait a minute, we've got to have much more community input. And then the situation changed. And today we live in a world that some people think is perhaps too participatory and that it's going to be very difficult to make decisions that affect a city as a whole because every neighborhood has its own sort of mentality, NIMBY sort of investment. And so I think we face different kinds of challenges today. There's lots of community input and it can actually stop change when taken too far. But I think this is a very important historical process that was both pushed from the bottom as well as recognized as a necessity by the top.
We have a lot of questions.
I don't remember in any of the urban renewal projects there being a lot of citizen public participation. The first project, the Whipper project, even the ones before that, the little parking lot ones, were pretty much driven by the Chamber of Commerce and by the merchants, the downtown merchants. They were pretty much the force behind that. And even as late as the Fort Trumbull project, they had neighborhood meetings, but they were really people came in and talked down to the people and said, well, what do you think of this plan that we've already decided we're going to do? Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure that there was all that much participation. Model cities, even something, I think the Model Cities program was basically put out of business by the establishment. And I can think of the newspaper. We did our first investigative project on the Model City program because we were hearing that they were, spending a lot of money in hotels and going on trips and stuff like that, kind of petty stuff. But the city was actually feeding us all this information from the treasurer's office. We were getting all the receipts and stuff like that. So they pretty much were trying to discredit the Model City Agency. But for a while, I think it did serve. You say, Jim, people came into politics and got involved and stuff. That was good. But as far as the projects themselves were concerned, I don't think that they were participatory at any period of time. You may disagree, but how about Boston? Did they
Well, it's interesting. I mean, that I think that there's evolution took place. Of it starts off certainly in the 1950s before Lowe got there under Hines, Mayor Hines. There was the greatest travesty. At least it's often looked that way, of urban renewal, the destruction of the West End neighborhood, which was a heavily immigrant neighborhood, where now Mass General is located, and the Charles River Park housing, middle class housing. It was part of this 1950s orientation, and we got to figure out a way to keep the middle class people in the city, and so they put up these apartment buildings. But over time, it did become, there were those same pressures that I saw in New Haven for more participation. But I do think it's interesting to see that there was variation. It's not so easy to kind of, to say this group was on one side and this group was on the other. One of the interesting cases that I found in Boston was where the middle-class black community in Roxbury was very positive about urban renewal, and they welcomed. When Lowe came, he got bombarded by letters and telegrams upon his sort of becoming the head of the Boston Redevelopment Authority by this middle-class community in Roxbury, saying, "Don't forget us. We really want that urban renewal attention." And one of the issues that was at work here was that these were middle-class blacks who could only own homes in that one neighborhood of Washington, in Roxbury. Washington Park had been a middle-class Jewish neighborhood. Jews had moved out. They were feeling the encroachments of more low-income people, and they were desperate to have city resources and federal resources to help them improve this one neighborhood. So it's complicated. There were definitely, you can't just say, I think urban renewal is all about black Negro removal, which is a kind of standard line. There were class differences within the African American community, and people had options that varied by their social class positions. So it's important that we really kind of look hard at who's wanting this investment and for what reasons and what options that they had.
I think in London, the turning point was maybe the Union Station, the controversy over Union Station. So it came from the historic preservation people, not from the general populace.
This was to save it.
To save the station. And that's at that point, I think Frank Driscoll, who was the city manager and had been the leader of the executive director of the redevelopment agency before that, he changed his mind about these clearance.
He had started by wanting to get rid of it, and then.
Oh no, he sort of didn't want to get rid of it from the beginning, but he had been part of it when they were in the Winthrop clearance and stuff like that. But and so he became sort of a preservationist, and I think out of the same movement, the New London Landmarks actually formed. That was
That's the same in Boston too.
to serve service. So.
I mean, the community gains a voice when it becomes a group of organized interests. So it seems to be key. Laura, picking up presentation.
A couple of things. I wanted to say that I had the opportunity to conduct oral histories with some of the Black New Londoners who lived through urban renewal, and I have to confirm what you're saying, that it was a very mixed reaction. Renters in particular told me that at least some of them did get help relocating, and one woman said that when she moved to the Crystal Avenue high-rises from this substandard housing where she was raising 5 children with no heat or hot water in a house that she said wasn't fit for humans to live in, she said she felt like she got a whole new life. And I also spoke to a member of the NAACP back then who told me that he supported it because he thought it would lead to a more integrated city.
Exactly.
But for homeowners, especially for Black homeowners, what I heard was that they did not get properly compensated because their neighborhood was undervalued. And in fact, we have the redevelopment agency forms in our office, and you can see how the neighborhoods were rated. And one of the conditions that would lead to a lower rating was a minority neighborhood.
Redlining, absolutely.
And so when people blame urban renewal for a systemically racist outcome, I think there's part of that. Certain neighborhoods were to be cleared and others weren't, but there were probably mixed motivations and mixed outcomes. But the underlying racist sin was the federal policies that pushed people to the suburbs, subsidized their mortgages that were only available to white residents, and to this day, we're wrestling with generations of minority families who weren't able to accrue generational wealth and then get stuck with the nonprofit social services. And when you talk about trying to raise the revenue for a city that's cash strapped, you can talk about trying to, have to tax, like the water authority or something, that we can try to tax for services as opposed to property taxes, and maybe we can come up with something more equitable that way. But you mentioned the word reparations earlier tonight, and the real issue is that money has to come from the suburbs, because the suburbs gained wealth. And you're still taking from too small of a pot if you're trying to build our services just from what we have in the cities. Do you have any ideas for how to do that?
We need a citizen epiphany in the state and in the country. About people taking a little more responsibility for, for community. We seem to have evolved over this same time period to kind of worship the independent operator, the cowboy who rides off into the sunset, and it is just totally, it's in control, and that's an unrealistic picture. Communities were created to produce community, because the collective is more powerful than the individual. We don't seem to have embraced that concept. This kind of recent wave of kind of appreciation of urban living is maybe one manifestation to it. We know from an environmental perspective that living in an urban area is infinitely, more environmentally sustainable than scattering throughout the landscape. So, maybe that will help. London has been very late to the game. People moving back. In the late 70s, we had a program trying to get properties on Bank Street renovated. They had architects who did the entire facade of all of Bank Street, giving it to property owners, actually giving them money to fix their property if they would do like extreme things like, maybe have like 100 amp service in your building so it doesn't burn down, because it still had the old, a lot of the ball and tube wiring, and our success rate was so poor, maybe 10% of the property owners were approached. They didn't see it worth them putting any money, but they're getting a revenue stream out of it. But let's fix up the upper floors, improve the appearance. Maybe you'd be able to attract some new ground floor occupant. Didn't hear it. It took all the way until really after 2000 when started to slowly get some reinvestment, and now largely out-of-towners who have come in, seen an investment doing basically the gut rehab that was necessary, and on the heels of that have been people who have been willing to live downtown. I think the only successful effort to get people back downtown was the Star Street project. 21 houses that were, 18 were literally abandoned. They were seagulls were living living in them. They were wide open, took a little acquisition, big debate by city council to work with, at that time was the Savings Bank of New London, which became Citizens, to basically take the properties, do a gut rehab, but in the context of the historical character of each of those buildings. Had to have owner occupancy. Number of them were 2 and 3 unit buildings, so that allowed some cash flow to make the numbers come out. And it's today you go down, it still works, it's still successful. A lot of home ownership, a lot of pride in that. It's a local historic district also. It's kind of an example of one thing that was done right and brought back a street that kind of celebrates that Whaling era and some great architecture and that you could live downtown and not be dragged away by these demons that never really existed, but in the fabrication of many people's minds, the fear of living in New London.
I think
Anyway.
I saw a couple more questions out there, but I think we can continue this conversation more informally at a reception just outside. So thank you for coming, and please give a round of applause.